I absolutely love this dress. Once I'd finished the strappy maxi version, I knew that I was going to want to make the sleeved version, and I got quite a few requests to add to the sew along for the 8177, so that's what I've done. Now, I definitely didn't pick the best fabric. I absolutely love how this dress has turned out. It's definitely going to be one of my favorites and get worn lots and lots and lots, but the red fabric for a sew along may be a little bit confusing, so I have added in a couple of close-ups of the pattern with me talking you through what I'm doing. So hopefully this is a clear enough and concise enough explanation of how I installed the gathered sleeves onto the 8177. This tutorial doesn't go into the making of the full dress. There is a full sew along for that, which I will list up here and in the description down below, but I do talk you through making the sleeves from start to finish and installing them and finishing them in the dress. So let's get started. This method's going to work for the long sleeve and the short sleeve, but I'm doing the long sleeve, so that's the pictures I'm going to work with. First up, we need to reinforce the sleeve at inner corner of armhole edge, pivoting at large circle and square as shown. Clip to large circle and square. On the pattern there is the circle for the back and the square for the front. That's 5/8 of an inch away, so I'm going to run a line of stitching in to reinforce this corner so I can clip into this part here, because this is going to get sewn to the underarm of the dress and this is the channel where the elastic is going to go in. So I've marked it on both sides, as you can see here. I'm just going to do some reinforcing stitches so that I can clip into that corner like the pattern shows. I think you can just about see, yes, there you go, I've got my reinforcing stitches in. I'm not going to clip into this until I absolutely have to, just in case anything goes wrong. I don't want to tear anything or have any fuzzies come off of this piece. The pattern next wants me to stitch the sleeve seam. I'm going to wait. I'm actually going to move over to step 17 and use the bias binding. So I'm going to put the bias binding right sides together around the top edge, which I can then turn the binding through and top stitch it down to create the channel for the elastic. I'm doing this before I sew up the side seam because I just think it's going to be easier to manipulate this neatly with the sleeve seam being open rather than having to negotiate a tube. So I'm going to do the binding first and then the sleeve seam afterwards, because they don't interact with each other at all, so there's no need. And as you can see here, the grey is the right side. You can see here the sleeve seam allowance is on the inside, so we're sewing the right side of the binding to the right side of the sleeve. And again, on this illustration you can see that the white part is the inside, there's the seam allowance, so right side of binding to right side of sleeve. Okay, so the right side of my binding is the side where you can't see any of the raw edges, and I've sewn that along the top edge of the sleeve. It says to sew the crease into the seam allowance. I've sewn this at 1/2 inch because when you press this over, there's also the roll of the fabric to take into account, which will take up that last 1/8 of an inch of the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance that is allowed at the top. So I'm now going to go and trim this seam allowance from the sleeve. So this is the binding, that's the sleeve, and then press everything so that the binding rolls round to the wrong side. Obviously once everything's trimmed and pressed it won't look this bulky, and then we can top stitch this edge down to create the channel for the elastic. Okay, so I've trimmed off the excess seam allowance and pressed everything over. As you can see, there's still like 1/8 of an inch of the right side of the fabric, which has meant at the corners it's all kind of lining up nicely. It's kind of lining up with the edge of the bias binding. I use 2-inch wide bias binding. Because that's just the size of the bias binder that I have. The packet calls for 7/8 of an inch, so I didn't think it would make too much of a difference, and it doesn't seem to have. So the next thing I'm going to do is top stitch along the edge of the bias binding to create the channel for the elastic, and then I can have a look at sewing up the side seams. I have top stitched and pressed, and it's all looking nice and neat and flat. This is a really nice way of doing this because obviously this is a very curved edge, and turning the seam allowance again and again would get very bulky and very difficult to do neatly. So yeah, I I really like the bias binding method of creating an elastic channel for this sleeve. So I am going to sew the sleeve seams together, and I'm going to do it at the French seam, which means I am sewing the wrong sides together at 1/4 inch, trimming, pressing, and sewing at 3/8 inch and pressing again to enclose the raw edges. So the underarm seam is sewn as a French seam, and I have pressed the seam allowance towards the front because I'm going to press the side seams of the dress towards the back, which will allow me to nest this sleeve seam with the side seam nicely so the dress seam will be on this side, sleeve seam on this side. So the next thing the pattern wants us to do is put the elastic into the channel that we've just spent all that time making. Okay, but I think actually I'm going to go ahead and make the elastic channel for the bottom of the sleeve, which wants us to turn the bottom of the sleeve up at the fold line and then turn the raw edge under by 1/4 inch and top stitch into place, leaving a channel for the elastic to go through. So I'm going to get that one done next because I do want to get all the kind of like fiddly bits done without any elastic puckering any fabric, just in case I end up with anything getting caught. So I'm going to press it up at the fold line and then turn the raw edge under by 1/4 inch and get that top stitch into place. Sleeves are hemmed and I have left little gaps for the elastic at the bottom. So that's the next thing that I'm going to do, is take my elastic guides, the one for the shoulder and then the one for the cuff, cut elastic, thread it through and sew it in place. I am meant to be using 1/2 inch elastic, which is why the channel is so wide, but I only have 1/4 inch elastic and I have a lot of it. So I'm going to use that. And it actually doesn't look too bad. It's going to give it kind of like a little bit of a floopy effect at the top. I'm not mad at that. I kind of like that. I have threaded my elastic onto a safety pin, which you will just have to trust me is in there. And I've threaded it through so that this end becomes flush with the end of the sleeve, which you can just see there, and then I have back tacked it. And now I am going to keep threading my safety pin through so the elastic comes out at the end of the other end of the channel, and then back tack and sew that one into place. And that's just a way of making sure that this end is completely secured before I start pulling and yanking on it, because believe me, I've had it where things have gotten lost and I've had to thread it all through again. So yeah, got the safety pin there, so I'm just going to keep feeding that through, and obviously because it's a narrow elastic I really have to be careful that it's not getting twisted, because we really don't want twisted elastic. But yes, just going to keep feeding my elastic through until the safety pin comes out of the end, so I can take that off. And now very carefully just going to bring it back so that the end of the elastic is flush with the channel, and I'm going to center it because, as I say, I'm using 1/4 inch elastic instead of 1/2 inch because it's just what I've got. Bring that so that it's flush up against the end of my channel, and once I'm happy with that, I am then going to backstitch over this a couple of times within the seam allowance to make sure that that's all secured. And then just going to repeat the process for the cuffs, but obviously sew the end of the elastics together. Elastic is in the bottom, elastic is in the top. Now we need to attach it to the dress, which means I need to make the dress. Let's get that done. I made a dress. I've actually attached one sleeve as well because I wanted to see how it went in, but this is what we're aiming for, the kind of like right angles, which you probably really can't see in this fabric, but there's like little right angles, which is the bit that we were reinforcing and clipping into on the sleeve earlier. So I'm going to show you how I put this sleeve in by doing the second one, because we discussed this the other day, and dresses really ought to have 2 sleeves. I'm going to just sew it in as a regular seam at 5/8 inch with the right sides together, because this is going to get hidden by the facing that goes on next, so I don't need to worry about French seaming this. So I'm going to take the sleeve, and there is a front and a back sleeve. The single notch on the sleeve is for the front and the double notch is for the back. Again, this is probably not the easiest print for you guys to see. If you remember, I pressed the sleeve seam towards the front so that I could nest it with the side seam of the dress, which I've pressed towards the back. So I'm going to nest those ones and then I'm going to pin everything into place, matching up the notches. And the first thing that I've actually done on the dress is I've drawn in the seam allowance. So there's a like cross point here. On the back, that is the circle, I think that's right, and on the front it's the, yeah, front is the square, back is the circle. I've ironed this a couple of times, so those marks have gone, but I've just gone back in and drawn those in again. You can transfer. I've lost my sleeve. There it is. Hello. Yeah, you can go back and transfer the markings over from your pattern at this point if they've gone, or I've just drawn 5/8 of an inch along each side to mark the point that I'm aiming for, and that is going to be the point that we've reinforced on our sleeve earlier, that little reinforcing stitching that we did. Let's move the elastic out of the way. So that reinforcing stitching that we did earlier here, so the corner of that is going to meet up with the cross of this seam allowance. Personally, I like to sew these in 3 parts. When there's a pivot point like this, I have got a whole video on pivot points which you can find up here. I personally like to sew to the pivot point, back stitch, and then clip into the fabric, rearrange the fabric and sew that last part of the seam, because I just find that it's much easier to control. I don't have to worry about leaving my needle down at the pivot point, rearranging everything and not getting anything caught in or bulky, because that's very easy to do. So I have matched up my underarm seam of my sleeve with the side seam of the dress. Going to match up the double notches, the at the back, single notch at the front, and just keep going until everything is pinned into place, and then sew that at 5/8 of an inch. And I'll show you a little bit closer what that looks like once I've got it done. At this point, I managed to not press record when I should, and then press record and record 24 minutes of the tabletop I have in the sewing room. So I filmed this little clip of a close-up of the pattern pieces, trying to explain what I was doing in this section, which hopefully makes it a little bit clearer than the very confusing red thread on red fabric. So what I'm very badly trying to show in this clip coming up is that I have pinned in the underarm seam right sides together with the dress. So this is the sleeve here, it's the wrong side of the sleeve, you can see there. This is the dress, and this is the wrong side of the dress, you can see here. You can see the seam allowances. So I've matched up the underarm seam with the side seam of the dress, and I've pinned from the square, which is at the front of the dress, all the way around to the circle, which is at the back of the dress. Now you remember when we very first started making the sleeve that we sewed a line of reinforcing stitches to those markings, the circle and the square, and the pattern says to clip into those, but I haven't asked you to do that yet. I've said to not do that until the very last minute. So what the pattern wants you to do is pin from the square round to the circle, and then also pin to the small dots either side, which signifies where the strap of the elastic that you've sewn is going to go in, this illustration here. So that pivot point that we reinforced earlier and that they've asked you to clip into, that's what they want you to swivel and basically to like a 90-degree angle, so that you can pivot at this point and then sew across the end of the elastic channel to secure the sleeve to the dress. You can definitely do it this way, but my preferred method is to sew from pivot point to pivot point and backstitch at the beginning and the end. So literally sewing from the square at the front all the way around the underarm seam at 5/8 of an inch to the circle and backstitching. Once I'm very happy that I have got the points matching up, that's when I will clip into that reinforced stitching that we did earlier, swivel the work around, turn the work over and start sewing this part in as a second seam, and then this part in as a third seam. So backstitching at the beginning and the end. I like to do it this way because when you get to these points, if you leave your needle down, which you totally can do, you do have a lot of bulk from the sleeve underneath here. So my preferred method is to sew up to that point and backstitch, because that way I've got all the bulk pressed over this way. Then I take the work out from under the machine, clip into the point, move all the bulk this way. You can see the bulk is illustrated here. Then I sew again. That way I'm making sure I'm not catching any of this bulk in my stitching. I find that if I try and do it in one pass from small circle to square, underarm to large circle to small circle and backstitch at the beginning and the ends, I do sometimes end up with bits caught that I don't want and I have to go and unpick. So I find that this way is easier. I'm so sorry I managed to take footage, 24 minutes of footage at the top of my table and not the actual pinning and sewing of this part, but hopefully you can see what I mean with this description and then also the footage that I do have. This is what the seam looks like from the dress side, and you can see I had a little bit of a thread nest there, but we've aimed and gone around that point there. And then on the right side I have clipped up to the reinforcing stitching that I did earlier, and I've sewn the part with the elastic in it to, this is the back, so I've sewn it flush against the back, so it's kind of like it's a 90-degree angle here. And then I've done the same on the other side. So of course the one that I did first to check and see how it went in perfectly, and then the other one that I did, I had to unpick a few bits and redo it, which you can just about see there. So the idea is you are aiming for a kind of like 90-degree angle in this part that you have to clip into that we reinforced right at the beginning, and you want, so you can see this is the front, so this is the part where the strap would have gone in, and this is basically the same width as the strap once it's sewn. So we've got our seam allowance either side, and that's now basted into place. And so the underarm seam is still raw on the edge because we're going to sew the facing into this to cover all of this up. So I've sewn at 5/8 of an inch the whole way around because that's the seam allowance, matched up the underarm seam and the side seam, matched up the notches. This is the back, so there's the double notch there, matched up, and the single notch at the front, matched up. I've sewn up to the pivot point, backstitched, then I've clipped into the work and maneuvered the strap around with the elastic so that it is centered in this part at the front, and then 5/8 of an inch over at the back. And now, as I say, we're going to sew on the facing to finish all of the raw edges off. So I'll get that pinned and show you what it looks like. This is currently a very spiky hedgehog. There's lots and lots of pins in here. So I've pinned it with the right sides together, sandwiching the sleeve in between the facing and the outer, and I'm going to sew it with the right side up, the dress side up, and the facing side down, because we want to follow the lines of stitching. This is the one that got a thread nest on. Gotta love that saying there. Thank you, sewing machine. But yes, so I want to follow the line of stitching to make sure that I am not kind of like letting any fuzzies escape, or I am not going to get any of the sleeve caught, because there's still an excess of fabric underneath this part of the sleeve. This is the right angle that we have created by snipping into the sleeve there. So there is quite a lot of excess of sleeve under here. I think you can see it. So I'm going to be really careful when I get to these pivot points. Probably going to get here, leave the needle down, reach inside the work, make sure that I'm pulling the sleeve out of the way so that I can then pivot and go around at the kind of like, I mean, it's not technically a right angle, but you know what I mean. So I am sewing with the dress side up so I can see my previous line of stitching, so that none of that will be visible on the finished dress. And I'm going to sew from the bottom hem on one side all the way up and around to the other side, like I did with the main sew along. Okay, it's all sewn. Let's see. Now, this is before I clip into anything. I want to double check that I've not caught the seam allowance of the sleeves or any bulk from the sleeves in any of those seams. That's looking nice and flat. And the other side, I mean, it's bulky. I mean, sorry, it is bulky at the moment because I haven't trimmed anything, but there's no puckers and nothing caught badly. So I'm going to go back and trim all of the seam allowance all the way around. I'm going to pink my underarm seam. I just do that because, I mean, technically you need to notch it, but pinking this underarm seam is a quick way of notching, in my opinion. Obviously I need to clip into all the corners, then I'm going to do some understitching, and then buttonholes and buttons, hemming, and the dress will be done. Hopefully those sleeves made sense to you. It's worked out how I wanted it to, so that's good. And that's how I attached these sleeves to the dress, and I absolutely love how it's turned out. I do have one more hack in mind. In fact, I've got two, well, technically one, I'm going to do one hack, but there's two hacks in it. I'm actually going to turn this into a zip back, no button down front waisted dress with these sleeves, but the sleeves gathered into the straps so that you don't need elastic. I do really like the elastic, but I also think that that could be an interesting look as well, and I want to try it. So I will be doing another video for this series, and that will be coming up very soon. If this video isn't clear enough for the instructions of how to get these sleeves in, I am not opposed to making another one in a fabric that's going to be a little bit more conducive to seeing what is actually happening on the screen. I am so glad that I made this one because I absolutely love it. This colour is awesome, the fabric is gorgeous. It's still available from the Textile Centre. This is September 2023 if you're watching this in the future, and I will list to it in the description down below. I highly recommend. So if you haven't made this dress yet and you enjoyed seeing how these sleeves went in, you might want to check out the full sew along here.